The translators of the King James Version, their biographies from Princeton Theological Seminary 1836, has some interesting information contained within it. The Biblical Repertory, April 1836, Article 1. 1. The English Bible, a sermon by the Reverend John W. Nevin of the Western Theological Seminary, published in the Presbyterian Preacher for January 1836. 2. The History, Character and Importance of the Received English Version of the Bible, a sermon by the Reverend William Adams, New York, USA, published in the National Preacher for October 1835. It is now 3 centuries since Miles Coverdale completed his great plan of translating and publishing the entire Bible in the English language. The sermons before us are in commemoration of this interesting event. They are sensible, well-written discourses on an important topic and richly merit the pains that have been taken to give them an extensive circulation. From the celebration of the first English version, the authors have taken occasion to direct the attention of the public to the history and merits of the one now in use. Though very unlikely in their style, they are equally admirers of this noble monument of the learning and piety of our fathers or forefathers, and have done a valuable service to the cause of truth by presenting in such a forcible manner its claims to the confidence of the community. The ripe scholarship evinced by one of the sermons, the earnestness of the other, and the good sense and piety of both, will cause them trust to be very generally read, and thus to be the means of correcting the erroneous opinions that are prevalent to some extent on the subject of which they treat. These sermons are the more acceptable at this time because a disposition has been manifested of late to disparage the receiving translation of the Scriptures. Does that mean somebody's tried to undermine it? From a contemporary journal, footnote indicator, and at the bottom here it says, in the Biblical Repository for 1835 is an article on the subject of English versions of the Scriptures, generally to which is appended an extract of 5 or 6 pages with the following notice by the editor. Quote, at the close of this article, we are happy to present the following communication from the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Homer of Newton, Massachusetts, USA, a gentleman who has given long and indefatigable attention to the subject and who is more intimately acquainted with it than any other individual in the country. Okay, from that we learn that the Reverend Dr. Jonathan Homer of Newton, Massachusetts has been some 40 years seeking to improve the text of the Common Version. We are not entirely certain, these two sermonists, these reverends, weren't entirely certain that they understood what was meant by this improved text. In the ordinary acceptation of that term, a perfect text of any author is one which gives the ipsissima or ipsissima verba of the original autograph. In no department of letters have more acuteness and industry been displayed than in the collation for this purpose of different editions of ancient authors, sacred and profane. Labours of this kind are of the utmost importance, especially in sacred literature, and the necessity has by no means ceased since the introduction of the art of printing, i.e. Gutenberg Press. Right? The utmost vigilance cannot prevent some misprints from creeping into a work that has gone through so many hundred editions as our Common Version of the Bible, and each mistake of this kind is not confined, as in transmission by manuscript, to a single copy or to the few which may be transcribed from it, but is perpetuated through many thousands of copies. To remedy this evil, Dr. Blayney undertook near the close of the last century to publish a text which should be perfectly accurate and might be safely followed in all future editions as a standard. This was issued in 1769 under the direction of the Vice-Chancellor and delegates of the Clarendon Press at Oxford. But notwithstanding the extreme care and labour bestowed upon this edition, there have since been discovered in it to no less than 116 errors, some of them of importance. The most perfect edition of their translation is said to be that given in 1806, or our translation is said to be given in 1806 by Eyre and Strahan, printers to His Majesty, obviously the King, but one erratum has it yet been discovered in it, or one error, or some errors, right? It is therefore probably the nearest approximation that will ever be made to an immaculate text. If, however, Dr. Homer has authenticated copies of all the principal editions and has in other respects the means and the abilities for giving a more thorough revision than that of Dr. Blaney, or a more accurate print than that of Eyre and Strahan, we would be the last in the world to discourage him from his long cherished purpose of improving the text of our common version. But if we may judge from the material which he has collected for his work, this is not precisely what he contemplates. His attention has been directed not to the collecting of different editions of the common version, but of copies of the different versions, those to which he has had access, as detailed by him through several not very intelligible pages. Matthew's Bible of 1537, Cranmer's of 1539, the Great Bible of 1541, a New Testament dated 1552, a Coverdale's Tyndale of 1551 or 1561, the Bishop's Bible of 1568, and the Common Version made in 1611. It's probably talking about the King James Version. Each of these versions, he says, renders particular passages correctly and in accordance with the views of the great modern critics. His plan, therefore, appears to be to select from each version those passages which have been rightly translated and to combine them in one perfect whole, which shall throughout express the exact meaning of the original and be in good English idiom or expression, or expressed in good English. That this is what he means by seeking to improve the text of the common version will be manifest from the concluding paragraph of this remarkable communication. Quote, each translation has its special good renderings corresponding with the best modern critics. The Bible of 1537 best agrees with Gesenius, Stewart, and the richest portions, these taken from other authors, there's a question mark there, of Rosenmuller. It was executed by the three first Hebrew, Greek, and English scholars and thorough Germans, ever known among the not too sure what that word is. It's S-E-V-E. Maybe it's several. It might be. Yeah, among several translations. The New Testament of Roger's Bible was 1537 and Coverdale's Tyndale 1551 and Tyndale's First Testament of 1526 are in English idiom, and they are executed most in conformity to the latest and best biblical critics. From the whole, with the consulted aid of more than 200 critical works, including the sources of each translation, he had been long seeking to improve the text of the common version. What Dr. Homer proposes then is not by a collation of the different editions of our translation to give an improved text of the same, but by comparing different translations and by various other consulted aids to give a new improved translation. It is what they said up above. So sometimes these books repeat themselves, these older books. The ground for this bold attempt, as well as the manner in which it has been conducted, will be evident from the following passages. Quote, I have employed myself for a portion of 11 years in collating and comparing each of these Bibles and Testaments with each other, with the originals, with the principal versions and comments and lexicographers of the three last centuries to the present date. I have compared them also with the notes which I began to collect at the age of 17 from the books of Harvard College Library, and which have been accumulating for 58 years following his collegiate course, prompted by the conscientious religious motive of the venerated, learned and indefatigable German Bengel, maybe it's like obituary or something, 1752. For about 40 years I have paid critical attention to various readings of both testaments of Hebrew and Greek text and of ancient respective versions, and have examined the authorities for and against them individually. I have endeavoured particularly to mark those in which the Old English versions and the Orthodox, or those of James Creed, or King James Creed, among the learned are agreed with few or no exceptions. Okay, we're pretty sure he's referring to King James here, not James of the Bible. He had found as a result that the Cranmer Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and the King James Bible were not independently rendered. King James Bible was under the control of the very arbitrary King James and his primate. No, it's not talking about ape. It's talking about something else. Somebody in charge. Okay. The head, the primary person. Men of strong prejudice and of no Hebrew, if any Greek, learning mere Latin scholars. It is throughout a version drawn from other versions and comments not exceeding 20. It was carried on with the felt early loss of their two greatest scholars, Hebrew Professor Lively and the President Dr. Reynolds. These two Bibles, the Cranmer Bible and the Great Bible, differing little from each other, I have also collated in all their parts and traced them successfully to their sources other than the original. So I affirm of King James Bible, this is in no part a new translation taken directly from the originals. Note that. This is in no part a new translation taken directly from the originals. It's talking about the King James. Those parts of the King James Bible which were drawn from Luther were not taken by them from the German Bible, but by the early translators, from whom they borrowed the English version. This person everywhere had traced to the English, French, Latin or German versions which preceded it. The circumstance he found proved by a full exploring of the New Testament in 1828. It has since been confirmed in every book of the Old Testament. When such statements as these are sent forth to the world as the oracles of wisdom, when Dr. Webster's expurgated edition is recommended to the public by the high authority of the faculty of Yale College, when even the Temperance Society cannot be advocated or the gospel preached without such constant parade of modern criticism and such frequent corrections of the received translation as to shake the confidence of the people in its accuracy, we hail with pleasure the publication of these sermons by Mr. Nevin and Mr. Adams, and hope they will go far to counteract what we cannot but consider erroneous and dangerous opinions. We had supposed the masterly discussions consequent upon the publication of the extravagant assertions of Mr. John Bellamy in 1818. Footnote indicator, and it says the sources of information on this subject and on the subject of English translation generally are Fuller's Church History of Great Britain, Lewis's History of English Biblical Translations, prefixed to his folio edition of Wycliffe's Life, Wycliffe's New Translation, 1731, Johnson's historical account of the several English translations of the Bible, originally published in 8 volumes, 1730, and reprinted in the 3rd volume of Watson's Theological Tracts, Newcomb's View of the English Biblical Translation, 1792, Horn's Introduction, Volume 3, or 3rd edition, possibly. He's got the Volume 3D. Mr. John Bellamy's New Translation and Notes, 1818 to 21, London Quarterly Review, Volumes 19 and 23, Eclectic Review, Volume 10, N.S. Anti-Jacobin Review, Volume 65, Todd's Vindication of Our Authorized Translation, and Translators, 1819. See if it's got any more of the other side. The other page. Whitaker's Historical and Critical Inquiry into the Interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures, 1819, and Supplement, 1820, and so forth. All these between 1818 AD 1821 were called forth by the misrepresentations in the introduction and notes of Mr. Bellamy's translation. For information requests respecting the particular lives of the different translators, the reader is referred to Townley's Illustrations of Biblical Literature and Chalmers' Biographical Dictionary, unless he is disposed to glean for himself from Fuller, Camden, Anthony Wood, and so forth. Probably other reviewers or translators or something like that. Okay, again, those parts of the King James Bible which were drawn from Luther were not taken by them from the German Bible, but by the early translators from when they borrowed the English version. This particular person had everywhere traced to the English, French, Latin or German versions which preceded it, which came before it. This circumstance he found proved by a full exploring of the New Testament in 1828. It has since been confirmed in every book of the Old Testament. When such statements as these are sent forth to the world as the oracles of wisdom, when Dr. Webster's expurgated edition is recommended, and so forth, they had supposed the masterly discussions consequent upon the publication of the extravagant assertions of Mr. John Bellamy in 1818 and the overwhelming array of evidence, internal and historical, then brought forward by Whitaker, Todd Lee, Hurwitz and Townley, and by repeated articles in the, it's got one something quarterly, there's a word missing there, anti-Jacobin and eclectic reviews, have put this question of the competency and fidelity of King James translators forever at rest. We are not a little surprised then at such unqualified impeachment of both by one was introduced to the public as better qualified to speak on the subject than any other individual in the country, and who from his tone and manner evidently would not think the eulogy misplaced. Our translators themselves say of the version that it is translated out of the original tongues, but Dr. Homer has discovered that this is a falsehood, that our version was drawn from sources other than the original, that it is in no part a new translation taken directly from the original. And that's what we said, because it reveals it in the introduction, the prefaces of your modern Bibles. It's like subtly there, you know. You have to detect it, that they were saying that all the translations came from the original, ancient, very old languages. Well, that's impossible, because they're all dead, no longer written, no longer spoken. Okay, they've gone the way of the dodo, the dinosaur. So you would have to use an original manuscript, okay, hidden, preserved, or just preserved, of those original languages, and then you have to have someone who is fluent or native in that particular original long dead language, say the Tav Ashrit, or the Aramaic, or the Tav Ivri, the Hebrew, or the Koine Greek, etc., who knew a method or knows a method to be able to translate all those into the nearest English equivalent without the common translated bias, twisting it, omitting bits and pieces, adding bits and pieces, etc., etc. Yeah. So yeah, we basically realise it's got to be impossible, okay, unless you use the root words of those original languages, because the modern vernaculars, or the modern form of them, they have the same root words, right? Similar words, okay, in the modern vernacular and also that old long dead language, and then you'll be able to translate it into, compare those, and you'll be able to translate them into the nearest English equivalent, as the translator, native-born Aramaic-speaking translator Victor N. Alexander did with the original ancient, very old manuscripts of the Old Testament, the Tav Ashri or Aramaic or Ashrit, and the Galilean Aramaic New Testament into the nearest English equivalent. Those he obtained from the Apostolic Church of the East High Priest in a Bible format. Okay, where are we? Okay, skip all that. Yeah, okay, so the translators themselves say of their version that is translated out of the original tongues, but Dr. Homer has discovered that this is a falsehood, that our version was drawn from sources other than the original, that it is in no part a new translation taken directly from the original. He is so certain of this that he has even given the precise date of the discovery and a full exploring of the New Testament in 1828. And he not only affirms that their work was not, as they say, translated out of the original tongues, but argues that it is impossible, as we just said, right? It should be so, they being under the control of the very arbitrary James and his primate, or those in authority, under his authority, men of strong prejudice, and of no Hebrew, if any Greek learning, mere Latin scholars. So they translated it from the Latin. Okay? They probably don't well, they sort of hint at that. Oh yeah, and also the Latin, translated from the Latin text and this other text and this and this and this, right? Okay, but they're not saying solely that it was completely translated by these way back under King James from the Latin. Okay, translations of the Latin scholars. They were mere Latin scholars. That is to say, the translators have published a deliberate falsehood on the very title page of their great work. Okay? See, as we said, the introduction, the prefaces of your modern Bibles have got the same sort of thing, saying, "Oh yeah, we translated from the original languages," when they didn't. Okay, so it's falsehood, a deliberate falsehood, on the very title page of their great work, and either falsehood or less information concerning them that we now possess must be charged upon those of their contemporaries who have represented them as the most learned, pious, and venerable company that were ever united in any one great literary undertaking. The more we consider these assertions, the greater is our amazement. There is no fact in history better ascertained than that the men called upon in 1607 to translate the Holy Scriptures were men eminently qualified for their task, and that they did translate directly from the original Greek and Hebrew. Where they found any passages already corrected, okay, we'll go back there. Okay, so the translators have published a deliberate falsehood on the very title page of the great work, and either falsehood or less information concerning etc. etc. we now possess. The more we consider these assertions, the greater is our amazement. There is no fact in history better ascertained than that the men called upon in 1607 to translate the Holy Scriptures were men eminently qualified for their task. Okay, that's what is stated. And that they did translate directly from the original Greek and Hebrew. Where they found any passages already correctly translated in any of the existing versions, conveying the exact idea of the original, and in good English, they did not, of course, wantonly change the phrase, and thus give unnecessary offence to the people, all whose prejudices would be in favour of that to which their ears had been accustomed. We have always admired the wisdom of that part of King's instructions relating to this subject. The translation then most commonly in use was to be followed with as little alteration as was consistent with fidelity to the original. When it was found to vary from the original and the true meaning had been expressed by any one of the earlier translations which was still in use, they were then to adopt its phraseology. Their compliance with this part of their regulations contributed, we doubt not, in no small degree, to that unparalleled popularity which this translation almost immediately received, and has to this day retained a popularity so great that all the preceding translations, though of acknowledged excellence, have gradually passed into disuse, and are now so rare that the possessor of some 4 or 5 of them trumpets it over the land as a literary curiosity. In adopting this course, those men did what any man of sense would now do who should attempt to give a new translation of the Bible. They did precisely what Dr. Homer himself proposes to do. They adopted the special good renderings of each existing translation, and where they found none such, they made one. This was in full justness of speech, giving a new translation, and so is what Dr. Homer calls seeking to improve the text of the common version. The thing aimed at in both cases is precisely the same. The only difference is that in the present case it is one, a responsible, unknown individual who takes up upon himself the important office without any urgent necessity, unsolicited by any public body, and untrammelled by any established rules. In the other case, it was a numerous body of the most illustrious scholars, maintained at the public expense, enjoying the public confidence, and summoned to the work by the head of a mighty nation hungering for the pure word of God. Okay, so it does cause a bit of confusion there, because at one point here it says this: the translators have published a deliberate falsehood on the very title page of their great work, and either falsehood or less information concerning them that we now possess must be charged upon those of the contemporaries who had represented them, etc., etc. Okay, and then on the other side here, it's like, it appears to be undermining that. I'm not too sure on that one. You just get that feeling, right? Okay, the translation of the scriptures is not a work to be entrusted except for imperative necessity to any one man, however gigantic may be his attainments or his genius. Dormitat aliquanto homerus. Though he may give a special good rendering in one place, he may give a special bad one in another. Hence, the number of translators employed by King James adds greatly to the authority of their work. What is overlooked or omitted by one may be observed or supplied by another. Although 54 men who knew nothing of Greek or Hebrew might not have the authority of one who did, yet when, as in the case of our translators, all of them were men of learning and ability, and some of them preeminently and proverbially so, the largeness of the number does give us security from mistake, which nothing else can. Everyone has his peculiarities of character and opinion which fit him or for some particular duty and disqualify him to a certain extent for every other. The man best suited to translate the Psalms of David would not be the one we should select to translate Paul's epistles, nor either of these to translate these parts relating to the details of Solomon's temple or of the Levitical ritual. Great attention was paid to this in allotting to the several translators their respective portions, each receiving that for which he was best qualified. By this means all the advantages arising from division of labour and the execution of the details were secured, while by another admirable regulation by which each man's work when finished had to be submitted to the inspection and judgment of all the rest, individual peculiarities were prevented from running into extravagance and harmony preserved throughout the whole. And that's what they apparently did with these 1966, 1967, 1976 revisions, where they're creating it. They decided to create a new modern English translation because languages evolve, languages change, they adopt, they adapt, all that sort of stuff. They add other words to it, new words come up, all that sort of stuff, which is a common fact, right? That they'd pass through 3 different people, on a board, and they'd review it and say, well, make some corrections here, re-edit it or something like that. But then what they did was they actually asked other people outside of that circle, of them to read all that sort of stuff and give them some pointers, all that sort of stuff. So that could be a problem, or it could have been a problem. I'm not too sure on that one. Where were we? The time in which our translators was made was peculiarly fitted to secure one which would become, as it had, a common standard. At the first outbreak of the Reformation, the errors of the Church of Rome were not all immediately dissipated. So they weren't all solved, right? Or fixed up, or taken out, or omitted, or whatever. Like the mist of the morning, one error after another gradually disappeared before the steadily increasing light of day. It was a century at least before the Reformed churches were fully purified from that polluting superstition which had equally defiled the doctrines, the rites, and the language of religion. The exasperation, likewise consequent upon the first separation from the Church of Rome, was exceedingly great on both sides, and did not soon subside. Had our version then both been made at an earlier period, it could not so admirably have escaped the opposite dangers of being in some parts unintentionally tinctured with anti-papal prejudices, and of saving in others of the still existing leaven of Mother Church, or Roman Catholic Church. The agitated waters of the Reformation had subsided, everything had cooled down, calmed down, and the pure foundation of truth was left undefiled by the pollutions, both of its turbid and its stagnant state. It was to that precise time when the zeal of Protestants had raised to be zeal against the Pope, so they calmed down and they weren't so much anti him anymore, and had not begun to be zeal against each other. So they're all at peace with each other, by the sounds of it, all good with each other. Protestantism was still to a great extent one and homogeneous. The different sects into which it was divided were sufficiently jealous of each other to prevent the improper favouring of any one set of opinions, and yet not so widely apart as to forbid all cooperation or concurrence. The lines of demarcation were not so strong and well defined, nor the barriers so impassable as they had since become. The work, therefore, is not sectarian in its origin or its character. It is in the strictest sense a national translation. It is the acknowledged and established standard of every denomination except the Roman Catholics and some few Unitarians. No translation now made could ever become this. the Presbyterians, the Associate Reformed, the Dutch Reformed, the Lutherans, the Congregationalists, the Methodist Episcopalians, the Protestant Episcopalians, the Baptists and the Quakers of this country, the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, and the various bodies of dissenters in Great Britain and elsewhere speaking the English language will assuredly never unite for this purpose, and a new translation put forth by any one denomination will never be adopted by the rest. If Dr. Homer thinks that all these will lay aside their sectarian jealousies and that more than 30 millions of people will free themselves of their deep-rooted prejudices in favour of Bible phrases to which their ears have been accustomed, out of respect to his select special goods rendering, his opinion differs greatly from ours, or these writers, these reverends, as to the attractiveness of an improved text of the Common Version. We cannot persuade ourselves that any such improvement would gain the public confidence, even though made from the accumulated notes of 58 years, with the consulted aid of more than 200 critical works, and agreeing with Gesenius, Stewart, and the richest parts of Rosenmuller. The age in which our translation was made was preeminently a learned age.